Welcome to the Future of Less Work, where we explore how work is changing one conversation at a time. I'm Nirit Cohen, and today's episode dives into how the next generation is reshaping not just what we expect from work, but how we design it. I'm really excited to host Amanda Schneider, founder and president of ThinkLab, the research division of Interior Design magazine. Amanda spent more than 2 decades studying the intersection of design, behavior, and the future of work. She sees the changing social contract of work not as a problem to solve, but as an opportunity to prototype what better work could look like. And she has a clear vision for why the future workplace isn't just physical or digital, but something in between. Phygital? Amanda, welcome to the Future of Less Work.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Let's start with that integration between physical and digital space. I know you come from a design background, so how do you think about that integration?
Yeah, so let me start by explaining that word because it's a really gross word in some ways, but it's merging physical and digital. And I think one thing that's really interesting is kind of how different generations see physical versus digital. So there's a fascinating TEDx talk by a woman named Hannah Grady Williams. And she basically proposes in this talk that people over 35 naturally see the world analog first, digital second. People under 30 naturally, because of how they were raised, see the world digital first, analog second. And if you're in that 30 to 35, it just depends how you were raised, kind of which world you fall into. And just because you were raised a native analog, as she calls it, like me, I am a Gen Xer, doesn't mean you can't immigrate just like you would immigrate to another country. But it means that is naturally how you're wired based on your behaviors and experiences. So what I want to do is kind of think about as it relates to our world of work. I think work has been designed in an analog culture where we think physical first, digital second. But as you mentioned in my intro, we've done a ton of research on Gen Z specifically and how their perceptions differ from maybe others in the workplace today. And one of the most interesting,
I would think that if you look at what we've all experienced in the last, 5-6 years, right? Work used to be a place you went to, but actually over the past couple of decades, the cables disconnected from the walls, computers became laptops, physical, a lot of the physical space that where we access our document became the cloud, right? So it morphed into the digital, even for us, from the older generations.
I would agree with that. However, I think for many of us, especially many of us from the older generations, the world we experienced from 2020 to 2023, let's say, was not necessarily a better experience. So we did experience something very different that disconnected work from a physical space into something we do, not necessarily only someplace that we go. But I think we have a lot of work to do to kind of reconcile those two experiences.
Okay, great. Let's talk about that because, like I said, I know you have this design lens on, right? And we usually, I hear a lot of people talking about the physical workspace in terms that have to do with the kinds of experiences that we expect to have there when we show up at the thing called the office, right? But you're thinking about this in a more broad perspective. So how do you design the intersection, right?
Yeah. And I think it's tough because these are traditionally siloed functions. So I run a podcast called Design Nerds Anonymous. And we just recently did an episode titled The Future of Work is the Entanglement of HR, IT, and Workplace Design. I think a lot of the conversation in the media right now is revolving around the physical workspace, and that is important. However, I don't believe that that's the only conversation we can be having. I think the reason it's focused there is because of capitalism, right? This is a big investment. The physical investment of the workplace tends to be first or second on the P&L, usually only behind your people and what you pay your humans. So therefore, that physical workplace and investment in that physical workplace has been, kind of a leading headline. However, research shows that people care more about when they work than where they work. So in order for design and designers to effectively solve this workplace dilemma that we're in, we really have to kind of understand this broader lens that integrates humans, technology, and the physical workplace.
So you're right, but here's the challenge, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I sit in my home office and I move from, say, one employer to the other, the only thing I'm really changing is my inbox, the name on my inbox, right? My email address. When I used to work in an office, you walked in the door and the corridors spoke the culture and the posters and the look and feel of your entire environment. It was a very different idea when you moved from one company to the other. I think part of the issue we're having these days is the digital space doesn't have the footprint of your organization and your culture. It's
Mm-hmm.
vanilla. And so
Mm-hmm.
basically without the physical space, companies don't know how to create the entire culture and experience, I would say, on the digital space.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. But I would also say that we've had hundreds of years to create this culture in our physical workplace. This digital space is very new. So I don't believe that it can't be done. I believe that it's harder to do because we knew that world and we're still learning this new digital space.
Okay, awesome. So let's talk about Gen Z because like you said, they
Mhm.
grew up in that space. That's their go-to. What can we learn from them?
Here's what I think is interesting about Gen Z is that Gen Z, the earliest of whom college educated, we're talking about knowledge workers here, graduated college in 2019. So this was just pre-pandemic. So assuming a traditional college path, they only had less than a year in the what did they the old is what they called it in our research in the old way, right? So then everything I think any of us that have been in the workplace for any amount of time can agree that things fundamentally shifted from about 2020 to 23, right? There was a pretty big
Right.
shift there, maybe bigger depending on your geographic area, how strict those lockdowns were, and how your company responded to this. So now coming into this new era, why I think Gen Z is so interesting is because they really didn't know the before. They didn't know how work happened before. So
Right.
it's really looking at a fresh point of view. Adam Grant calls this a vuja day moment. It's seeing the same thing we've seen many, many times, but with fresh eyes. So by looking through the lens of Gen Z, who to them, they are blind back to this phygital world. They're blind to their physical digital fluidity. So by looking at what's as natural to them as the air they breathe, perhaps we can learn something that helps all of us really navigate this new working world.
So can you give me examples? What do you see? What does your research tell you about how they navigate this fluidity between the worlds that maybe we don't get?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So one of the interesting things in our Gen Z research that was shocking to me as a Gen Xer was when we asked them what they do in real life, they would talk about digital tools that they're using with their colleagues, right? When we asked them what they're doing digitally, they would talk about colleagues that they're connecting with. So they, in their minds, didn't separate the physical and digital world in the same way that we do. So I want to liken this to let's look at childhood experiences. When I was a kid, I would get home from school and I would go out to my neighborhood park and hope that I saw some friends there and see who I could connect with, right? My kids, I have teenagers now, they don't work that way. They're going to text everybody to figure out where they are, and then they're going to physically meet up. So for me, it started physically and then maybe went digital. I might have called someone on a landline phone with a little cord, right? But for our kids, it starts digitally. So if you think about that and transitioning this into the workplace, right now we are still having these conversations in the media around return to office or return to work mandates or things that are being handed down about you have to come in. But I want to argue that if we think about this phygital world, what's going to make them want to come in is finding ways to build relationship with them digitally that makes them more comfortable to come in. And let me give you a quick example of this. Think about the feeling that you had going into the junior high cafeteria when you were in junior high, right? You've got your lunch tray, you're scanning for your friends. How do you feel right now?
Anxious.
Anxious. You're
Are
looking
they
for
here?
someone.
If they're not, yeah, if they're not here,
Yeah,
what am I going to do? Or who am I going to sit with? Right.
exactly. Exactly. And these kids that are coming into the workplace today, um, they struggle with that feeling. I think more than even previous generations. Even all of us would have felt anxious, but they've had kind of this scaffolding of digital connections to make those friends in the past. So if we can find ways to connect with them digitally, that makes that feeling a little bit more connected when they come into the office. Something as simple as my face in my email signature that helps them connect. A Schneider at sandowdesign.com is that human that looks like this. So when I'm walking into the workplace, I automatically have a connection. They are used to that digital connection in every other area of their life as they make those social connections. And I don't believe that we've transitioned that to the workplace yet.
So if you think about it though, why would they even need to come in, right? I mean, if they're very used to creating relationships, because our usual standard answer is you come into the office for the relationships, for the meetings,
Mm-hmm.
for the interaction, for the people. But this is a generation that played video games, multiplayer games. They actually have friends that they've never met, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's friends in the digital spaces. We call it friends, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why would they come in?
Well, and this is, I'm working on a book right now. So, kind of the first chapter of my book, the premise of the book is that there is a growing trust gap right now. We see it in our research. If you look up, we did an article in Forbes in 2023 called The Great Back to Office Debate Won't End in 2023. You can find this chart there in that article. And it shows a growing trust gap. We asked the question, what's the biggest problem with hybrid work? And it's small. It's about 12% of baby boomers. And you see it across generations grow. And it is about double that, around 24%, almost a quarter of Gen Zers see this trust gap as a problem. So I
So
think
when you
that
say trust gap, just let's be
Mhm.
really clear.
Yeah.
What do you mean by trust gap?
So they say the biggest problem with hybrid work is trust and building trust with their organization and their colleagues.
So basically, because I haven't met you, because we haven't had the physical interaction in the office, we it's harder for us to build a relationship through digital tools.
I think that that's the way a lot of, elder generations in the workplace interpret it, that it has to go back. It has to go back to in person. We have to come back to the office 5 days a week because that's the only way we can build trust. I
Okay,
want to
but that's
challenge.
not how Gen Z interprets it, right? That's not
I
the
don't,
only way they build trust.
that is not the only way that they build trust. They expect this phygital world. And I want to challenge whether we're talking about your first day on the job and onboarding, whether we're talking about mentorship and how that happens, we have not reframed our work culture for this phygital era that we're in. So one could argue we just need to go back into the office and it has to be in person. That is one way to look at it. And I believe some companies will take that tact and are taking that tact. Another way to look at it, and I think the way Gen Z looks at it, is really looking at what needs to be physical, what can be digital, and how do we optimize both worlds.
So Amanda, I think I want to move beyond it's almost like the convincing. So I let's not
Mm-hmm.
talk about RTO. Okay. So uh,
Yep.
this show doesn't, there's no one here that has ever argued that the only way to work is actually to go back to, and frankly, can't
Mm-hmm.
go back to the future. That's not a real thing. But I think we do really struggle with how do we build connection, trust, culture, togetherness, short, communication channels in the digital space because we don't
Mm-hmm.
understand how to do it. We tend to go back to saying, well, let's just move this stuff back to the physical space, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
is
Mm-hmm.
then back to the office.
Yep. Yep.
So
So
I
are you
think what
asking
I'm trying to
yeah.
understand, I'm asking from all your research and work,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's examples but practically speaking, right? How do we operate better in this digital space so that we create it as I love the fluid metaphor that you used, a
Mm-hmm.
fluid space, right?
Mm-hmm. 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 I mean, I think it's multifaceted. I'm going to do my best to say it quickly and succinctly. I think the biggest thing is we have to get a bit more intentional. We have relied on a lot of cultural norms that have been built over hundreds of years that aren't necessarily stated, that are required for our youngest generations to just kind of observe and learn more in the apprenticeship model, right? I think to be successful in this hybrid era, the one word that has come up in our research more than anything other is intentionality. There are some very, very practical suggestions in a book called How the Future Works. Brian Elliott, Sheila Subramanian, and Helen Cupp wrote this, and they talk about contracts that you can build with their teams. And I think that that will be a key element to the future and figuring out this complex, dynamic, fluid environment that we're going into is how we look at work teams. I think instead of being hierarchical and coming from the top down, it is going to be more tribe based, if you will, and looking at, what your accounting team needs. That might be different than your engineering team. That might be different than your creative team, right? And building these intentional work rules that work for those teams, and then figuring out the balance of how to rebuild this pyramid from the ground up rather than the top down, which is a huge cultural shift, right?
Yeah, well, I'm actually, it's funny because I'm actually working on an article right now that suggests that we need to shift from teams to communities because
Mm-hmm.
of that, change in the hierarchy. But I think you're saying even more than that. It's not just a structural thing. The intentionality is being intentional about who we are, how we work, what to expect, how we like to communicate at all the different levels, right?
Mm-hmm.
The posters on the walls, right? They're no longer there. You have to be intentional about the messaging you want to transmit.
I would agree. I would wholly agree with that. And I think a key piece of that is also each of us getting in touch with our own needs. When I was preparing for my talk that's now on TED.com, one of the lines in there said, the future of work starts with each of us understanding when and where and how we work best. And I was practicing and giving this to my best friend. And she was like, Amanda, like you work in this world. So you've thought about this a lot. But most of us have never questioned when and where and how we work best. The office is just somewhere you went and you went from 8 to 5. Like I've honestly never thought about that. And I think that that was a really big aha moment for me because I do spend a lot of time in this space. But if we can't figure out when, where, and how each of us individually are most productive, no one can design effectively for that. So, in order
Yeah.
for designers to be effective, we all have to understand ourselves and we have to start having these dialogues with our teams, with our communities, however you want to kind of say that word, about how to make those trade offs.
Yeah. Yeah. And we just had an episode, so a conversation about the Microsoft's data shows the infinite work day, right? That we work
Mm-hmm.
from really early in the morning through the weekend. And part of that has to do with bringing back the structures that the office building provided
Mm-hmm.
and the office hours provided. And we have to bring it back in different ways. Part of that, by the way, I mean, you're a designer, you'd appreciate it, right? But I remember after COVID, I actually went to Milan Design Week and I went to look at what the home furniture
Mm-hmm.
changes with work from home, right? So how do you create the space that says I am now working, which isn't just, a table in your bedroom that just feels like you just crossed from your bed directly to work and there was no transition.
Mm-hmm. And also, how do you end it at the end of the day? A
Yes.
lot of people, especially let's see Gen Zers in crowded roommate situations, their desk is probably in their bedroom. And in this day and age where it's not an 8 to 5, or even if you are in an office 8 to 5, there's still stuff that's happening and being texted you and coming to you after hours. How do you shut that door and turn it off so you can mentally
Yes.
get a rest? I think these are all cultural
Absolutely.
things we've got to figure out, or we're headed for a cliff of burnout as a culture and a society.
Yeah, I am. I think we're actually already there now. It's figuring out how to back from there. So you also talk about another aspect I've seen you talk about it, and I think it comes out of that research is the radical transparency,
Mm-hmm.
right? That how's that showing up in your research and how we end up conversing around work?
Hmm. I mean, I think again, this goes back to that phygital word that we were talking about, because radical transparency to a Gen Zer, to a digital native, is going to be you are the same person in real life that you are online and digitally. That your behaviors or your mission statement, let's say that you have online, it might not be physically on a wall in a location anymore, or it might be also on your website, also on a wall. They care more that your leadership acts in accordance with those stated goals or missions or purpose for the company. So I think really important to them is really aligning who you are in person, who you are digitally, and how that takes shapes with your actions authentically. I think where a lot
Yeah.
of companies, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that aligns perfectly with the intentionality, because if the posters are
Mhm.
no longer there because you're not in the office, you actually need to make sure the posters show up in how you behave and how you engage in everything you do, right?
And I
Otherwise, they
think
don't exist.
it translates even into recruiting. Ryan Jenkins wrote a really interesting book that is about Gen Z. And it says outside of personal friends and family, the number 2 place that they go when they're looking at a company to decide if they want to work there or not is YouTube. Because they're looking for day in the life of, right? They are raised as a generation that can Google anything. They've always had access to this. It's only going to get faster with AI and the integration of AI. So they want to understand not marketing speak, not something that was polished and put out by a corporate marketing group. They want to see, like, what does it look like for a workday with Amanda? And often you can find unedited videos on YouTube. So that was the number 2 source for them. And I think that's a really important thing as we try to translate tangibly, what does this authenticity mean and look like? It's exactly that.
Perfect. Okay, so here's my question to you. I usually wrap up with, instead of an answer, what do you think is the question we should all be asking ourselves about the future of work?
To me, the core thing we could be asking is diving deep into our own selves about when and where and how we work best. And I know that feels a little bit redundant to the conversation that we've already had in this last half hour. But if we can't identify that for ourselves, it doesn't mean we'll get everything that we ask for. But if we can't be aware of that, we can't manage to that. I work best at 4 a.m. I would guess for you probably, and a majority of our listeners, most people don't want to work at 4 a.m. But I have structured my day in my consulting practice where I do my heads down work at 4 a.m. because that's when I'm sharpest and fastest. If I wait till 4 p.m. after a full day of meetings, it's going to take me 2 hours to do what would take me 20 minutes to do at 4 a.m. So the more we can learn these things about ourselves, the more we can define how they work together as a team, and the more we can give these criteria to what workplace designers need to do to design effective workplaces. And I do believe we will always need some sort of physical meetup space. I just think it's probably going to look a little bit differently than it has in the past.
Yeah, and I think in a way you're also saying design, your life, your environment, the one you're
Mm-hmm.
working in, to fit this, right? So
Mm-hmm.
make sure that you have the ability to go into work, do your heads down work when you're most effective, and also step away from work in some manner, right? Figuring
Mm-hmm.
out how to do that is going to be really important.
Agreed.
Wonderful. Wow. All right. Thank you, Amanda, for joining me today. For more about Amanda and her work, you check out the links in the podcast description. Thank you for joining us in the Future of Less Work. And remember, your best people do not work because they have to, nor because you tell them to, or you measure them on it. They work because they want to, because by working for you, they're accomplishing what's important to them in life. Till next time.